Today we are going to tell the World War II story of one company of American paratroopers which performed a surprise assault against an enemy position and review one trooper's charge against an estimated 150 Japanese soldiers. Stay tuned for the account of the 11th Airborne Division's famous Rat's Ass Charge. Hello friends, thank you for joining me today for this episode of Down from Heaven, the 11th Airborne Division in World War II and beyond. My name is Jeremy Holm, and I am a former American bobsled athlete who has now turned 11th Airborne historian to honor my grandfather and his buddies who risked it all to defend freedom in World War II. I am the author of 3 books on the Angels, and it's an honor to travel across the United States lecturing on the history of the 11th Airborne from 1943 through today. Now, earlier this year, I was in Virginia for my grandmother's funeral, and it was a privilege to honor both Grandma and my grandfather, First Lieutenant Andrew Carrico, with a dual memorial service. Now, Grandpa passed back in 2016, and he was cremated, so that they could be buried together when Grandma passed, and they now rest in peace side by side. And man, it was so powerful to watch my father, a Vietnam veteran, render a last salute to Grandpa at the graveside. Now that service actually brings me to the topic of today's video, this little guy right here. And I say little, but he's pretty heavy. Now, this bronze statue represents an act of courage and valor that some angels believe should have earned this particular paratrooper the Medal of Honor. And so today we're going to tell the story of Private John Bad Soldier Bathory and the 511th PIR's famous Rat's Ass Charge. Let's jump right in. In the winter of 1944, the 11th Airborne Division was fighting a ferocious enemy in the mountains and jungles of Leyte in the Pacific Theater. So, while Allied forces had retaken much of the island from Imperial Japanese forces, the mountain ranges that were running north to south contained the enemy's main supply line. And Leyte's environment was proving challenging for those Allied units to move up into the mountains. Well, the 11th Airborne's Major General Joseph May Swing told General Douglas MacArthur, "My boys can do it." So on Thanksgiving Day of 1944, General Swing sent the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment to initiate the division's movement across the island's waistline from east to west. And this was part of Operation King II. And as I've mentioned in some previous episodes, the Leyte campaign was brutal for the Angels. We're actually going to release a video dedicated to the Leyte campaign in a few months, but every trooper I interviewed or spoke with said Leyte was far worse than the Luzon campaign in 1945. One even said after Leyte, hell was a vacation. But the Angels campaign consisted of, pitch black nights spent in muddy foxholes due to the high elevation. It was chilly water. They spent weeks with little to eat, and because of the jungle environment, their uniforms were literally rotting away. It rained all the time. This is a monsoon season, so leeches were everywhere. Their medical facilities were like MASH in the mountains, one said. And this was just the environmental conditions. Their enemy, the Japanese, were known for their fight to the death tactics, and the Angels learned quickly that their adversaries were to be respected in their own right. On Leyte, banzai charges were common. Japanese soldiers infiltrated the lines at night. And the enemy even dropped paratroopers on the Angels around the San Pablo airstrip in the only paratrooper versus paratrooper engagement in the Pacific Theater. And more on that battle in a later video. I know we have a lot of history to cover on this channel, so just be patient. We're working on it. But as the Angels pressed forward through December of 44 towards Ormoc Bay, they were taking heavy casualties along the way, and by December 20th, the paratroopers of the 511th PIR could smell the ocean air, so they knew that they were getting close to their objective. And, these young paratroopers had spearheaded the division's push to the West Coast. And General Swing wrote to his father-in-law, General Peyton March, that he could follow the 511th's trail simply by following the enemy dead they left behind. Now, when General Swing suggested his 187th Glider Infantry, the precursor to today's 187th, Rakkasans, General Swing wanted the 187th to take over the drive into Ormoc, but the 511th's regimental commander, R&D Hard Rock Hogan, radioed the 187th's Lieutenant Colonel Arthur H. Wilson, who commanded 2nd Battalion, and Hard Rock said, "We will not need your help to take the Southwest Hill." Now, this hill was Japan's last line of defense standing in Angel's Way, and it was known by 3 names. Regimental headquarters called it the West Ridge, but 3rd Battalion called it Leyte Hill after battalion commander Lieutenant Colonel Edward Leyte. Leyte's boys from Howe and Item companies had assaulted the lower elevations of the hill and pushed about 250 yards west of the southern crest. I Company's assault led them to within about 20 yards of the crest, and once there, these young angels fixed bayonets and took the objective one bloody foxhole and trench at a time, and then they stopped to regroup. But eager to push to the coast, Colonel Hogan ordered the 511th 2nd Battalion to, quote, "get off your ass and get going," end quote. Hard Rock wanted them to take the north side of the ridge, and this is where the hill gets its 3rd name, Hacksaw Ridge, after 2nd Battalion's Lieutenant Colonel Frank S. Hacksaw Holcomb. And no, this is not this Hacksaw Ridge where Desmond Doss earned his Medal of Honor 6 months later in May of 45 on Okinawa. Now, back on Leyte in December of 44, Doss's 307th Infantry Regiment was only about 20 miles north of the Angels' positions. And that's when Hacksaw Holcomb's paratroopers they gained about 400 yards on Hacksaw Ridge's northern heights, and then at that point, they too had to stop for the night. The next day, December 21st, which was the 34th day of the 11th Airborne's Leyte campaign, Colonel Hogan again sent companies H and I to finish pushing the enemy off Hacksaw Ridge's northern slopes. And 3-5-11 found themselves facing several reinforced bunkers, but they pressed forward and, soon they became even more highly motivated to destroy the enemy. You see, there was still a strong body of Japanese on the ridge's southern end, and some of those Japanese soldiers had cannibalized the bodies of a 3rd Battalion machine gun crew that was killed in earlier fighting. And yes, you heard me correctly, enemy dead were found carrying cooked pieces of human flesh in their pockets, which of course angered the Angels to no end. When news spread through 3rd Battalion, which was still attacking the northern ridge, of what had happened, everyone just started seeing red. Meanwhile, Hacksaw Holcomb sent 2nd Battalion's E and F companies up the steep southern flanks of the ridge, and these young paratroopers found themselves also facing well-entrenched enemy positions. They inflicted heavy losses on the enemy, and at 1550, 2511 reported, "We have assaulted the hill and taken it." Now, Colonel Hard Rock Hogan then told Hacksaw to push as far as possible up the ridge before setting up their perimeter, but things basically stopped there for the day. 2nd Battalion had gained about 900 yards, but my grandpa, First Lieutenant Andrew Carrico, said after repeated unsuccessful attacks against a tenaciously defended enemy strongpoint, the battalion was forced to disengage and establish a perimeter for the night. Now, while 2nd Battalion dug in, Colonel Hogan met with General Swing and Hard Rock, updated the general on their advances, current positions around the ridge, and so forth. We don't have the full notes on this meeting, but Hard Rock returned to his CP and said that an early attack would be the most effective means of eliminating Hacksaw Ridge's last defenders. I'm going to guess that Hard Rock talked General Swing into letting his boys have one last chance to effect the breakthrough before Swing turned it over to the 187th. And the reason Hard Rock wanted an early morning attack was my grandfather explained that on Leyte, the Japanese were famous for sleeping late. But there was perhaps another reason for Hard Rock's early morning orders. General Swing had given him permission to send 2nd Battalion up Hacksaw Ridge for another attempt to take the hill, but only if Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Wilson's 187 did not overtake them first. Again, that's the battalion that Hard Rock radioed saying, "We don't need your help." Well, General Swing was already bringing Colonel Wilson's glider boys forward, so at 1900, Captain Stephen Rusty Cavanaugh was notified by Hacksaw Holcomb that his Company D would effect the frontal assault the following morning, December 22nd. And Steve was told that this was the 511th's last chance to effect a breakthrough before the 187th took over. He was also informed that the trail leading up to these last enemy positions was narrow and densely forested, and posed a problem because now it's nighttime in the jungle, so no reconnaissance could be made by Steve or his scouts, which meant he wasn't able to take a look for himself, so he had to go on the descriptions of others who had seen it during the daytime. So with far too little information for his taste, Captain Cavanaugh left Battalion HQ. Now, Steve and I were able to talk on the phone throughout the years before he passed away in 2019, so it was great to get his perspective on this final push on Leyte. And if his name sounds familiar, it might be because in August of 1968, then Colonel Stephen Cavanaugh took over the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, which is quite a mouthful for that top secret group, known today as simply MACV-SOG or SOG, S-O-G. Now, Steve had a long, distinguished career that lasted for 30 years, but when he reached D Company's position late on December 21st, 1944, Rusty gathered his remaining officers and said, "We're going to hit the Japanese just before daylight and take the ridge." Steve's plan was to gamble on stealth and surprise. So Dog Company would pass through Fox Company's positions, cross the line of departure, and a column of platoons, and my grandfather's first platoon would take the lead and effect the main assault. And Captain Cavanaugh, or Rusty, elected to march directly behind First Squad, which would allow better operational control. And Steve and Grandpa, First Lieutenant Andrew Carrico, had become good friends by this point in the war and would remain close for over 60 years. Now, early on December 22nd, as a heavy rain fell, Scout Private First Class David Vaughn led 1st Platoon across the line of departure at 0400, while the rest of D Company hung back. And at first, the trail leading up to the ridge, it was so narrow that Captain Cavanaugh said theirs was an attack with a two-man front. And you can see in this photo taken right after the assault, this is a very narrow approach. Now, once they got past this point, they quietly scaled the trail to roughly 200 yards from the enemy's suspected positions. And, they paused to fix bayonets, recheck their rifles, machine guns, and ammo, and so forth. And they're under orders for silence, so the Angels just shared nods of good luck before First Squad wheeled off to the left of the trail and Second Squad headed to the right. Now, my grandpa carried this platoon roster with him throughout the war, so I'm going to go ahead and put these names down in the comments of this episode so you can see the names of the troopers who participated in this assault on December 22nd, 1944. Now, as dawn crept through the heavy clouds, these advancing paratroopers discovered and silently eliminated 2 enemy outposts. So by 0530, Second Squad was well within the main enemy position, and Private First Class Billy Pettit, they called him Billy the Kid because he was so young. He and I talked a little bit about this assault as well, and he said that while they were crouching in the jungle foliage, the hushed Angels watched Japanese soldiers milling about the area. Some were half dressed, others were preparing meals. It was obvious that they were just waking up or just starting to wake up. And that's when the Angels noticed a sentry at the edge of the field about 15 yards away. And given his position, he would have to be eliminated quietly so First Platoon could advance. So everyone watched as Scout Private Gilberto Carranza Sepulveda of El Paso, Texas, snuck forward. He's got bayonet at the ready, but as luck would have it, the Japanese sentry turned at the worst moment and noticed Gilberto's advance. So the 6'2" paratrooper shot him, which of course drew the attention of all the Japanese in the area. An enemy machine gunner opened fire first and sprayed Gilberto's area, followed by the gunner's buddies who also opened fire. The Angels said it was kind of erratic. But 2nd Squad hit the dirt, and hearing shots off to his right, thinking things had kicked off, my grandpa, First Lieutenant Carrico, bellowed D Company's catchphrase, "Rat's ass," which signaled 1st Squad to begin the attack by throwing grenades at the enemy positions to their front. Now, D Company's catchphrase started sometime stateside. Nobody could really remember when, probably Camp McCall. But it was during training, and one time Private First Class David Vaughn declared, "I don't give a rat's ass." So it just stuck. And after Grandpa shouted the command, 1st Squad pulled pins and tossed their grenades. And explosions shattered the morning air, and 1st Squad rushed to engage the startled Japanese on the left. And 1st Squad's Sergeant George Taylor led 6 of his men into a strong enemy position, which they destroyed with more grenades, which allowed the rest of 1st Platoon to move forward into the fight. And I want to point out that during these initial movements, Captain Stephen Cavanaugh stayed right behind my grandfather, 1st Lieutenant Andrew Carrico, the platoon leader. So both these officers right up front. Steve said it was because their radios were ineffective and he wanted to be close to be able to command the operation verbally. Now, off to 1st Squad's right, 2nd Squad got into the action, and Private First Class John Bad Soldier Batory of Boston, Massachusetts, began hurling phosphorus grenades on the run to burn enemy positions as they moved forward. And, in all the excitement, the 6'2" machine gunner ran right into a tree branch, which, smashed him in the face. So it smashed his nose, it knocked off his helmet, sent it tumbling, and, eyes blurry from the pain, of course, John failed to notice a Japanese soldier about 6 feet away who was drawing a bead on his head, but luckily Private Augustus Wilder dropped the enemy, saving Batory's life. John's ammo carrier, Russell Kilcollins, and assistant gunner, Stuart Stevenson, caught up to the dazed machine gunner who was still on his back, and John was just muttering, like right between the eyes, and, they realized John thought he'd been shot. And Private Kilcollins pointed to Batory's enemy, and yelled, "Get up, you ran into that tree limb." And at this point, the firefight had enveloped the whole hillside, and 1st Platoon was slowly pushing up the hill. And that's when the first Angels, to reach the crest of the hill, looked down and realized that besides the expected main line of resistance, 1st Platoon's 35 paratroopers were now almost face to face with a withdrawing Japanese column of about 150 soldiers on a trail 10 to 15 feet wide. And my grandpa just said it was a machine gunner's dream. Now, when the first Angels appeared over the ridgeline, the Japanese in the column, equally startled, opened fire, and the heavily outnumbered 1st Platoon found themselves taking cover and wherever they could, and immediately in danger of being overrun. And HQ2's Private First Class Dean Marks, who had accompanied 1st Platoon that morning, he said, "The Japanese fire and small arms and heavy machine guns was heavy, but not really accurate at first. We were pinned down, and then we were in a hell of a firefight." The Angels fought back, and then Dean said, quote, "Out of the blue, someone hollered, 'Rat's ass, who's with me?' It was a guy by the name of John Batory." Now, full of adrenaline, John had shaken off the pain from his damaged nose where he ran into the tree, and he could hear the heavy fire going on up the hill. So he asked for a full belt for his 30 caliber machine gun, which Private Stuart Stevenson helped him load, as bullets are flying overhead. And John then stood up and slung his 30-pound Browning light machine gun on webbing over his shoulder. And he grabbed the barrel with an asbestos mitt, kind of like John Basilone, and John Batory raced up the hill to the crest where he saw everyone was pinned down. And then, with decaying jump boots and rotting uniform that exposed jungle ulcers on his legs and body, John stood on the crest and shouted, "Banzai, rat's ass, who's with me?" And 1st Platoon then watched the exposed Angel charge the enemy column, firing a full burst from his hip. Now, Trooper Dean Marks explained the severe danger John put himself in, if you haven't imagined it already. He said, Most important, if you did fire from the hip, you had to stand, and anyone who stood up in any kind of firefight was dead right then. But John didn't die, and his courageous charge galvanized 1st Platoon into performing a banzai charge of their own. Trooper Marks wrote, "As Batory hollered, he began shooting. He was defying the Japs and certainly inspiring us as we were hugging the ground. He cut loose with 2 long bursts. Spontaneously, the whole line jumped up and started laying down fire and hollering rat's ass. Dean said, a couple of enemy woodpeckers opened up, but our firepower overwhelmed them." Now, my grandfather, First Lieutenant Andrew Carrico, had been John's platoon leader for the past 20 months. And when he was telling this story, he also said with a laugh, Batory was a soldier that was a great soldier in combat, but he wasn't worth a damn in the everyday. He was always in trouble. Now, Captain Kavanaugh said John was an Irish lad who loved to fight and had a reputation in the outfit for being a good guy, but frequently at odds with authority. And John's buddy, Private First Class Billy Pettit, said John was an excellent soldier, but he was a brawler. He was always fighting someone. So I tell you all that because I want to point out that during the rat's ass charge, John was actually missing his 2 front teeth because of a barroom brawl back in the States before the Angels had shipped over to New Guinea and then Leyte, and he just didn't have time to get them fixed. But inspired by John's charge, 1st Squad on the left, led by 1st Lieutenant Carrico and Sergeant Taylor, and 2nd Squad on the right, led by Staff Sergeant George Reb Cushwa and Private First Class William Dubes, began kind of a trotting, marching fire line that just decimated the Japanese column and the enemy's remaining defensive positions on the ridge. The Angels rushed forward with shouts of, rat's ass, banzai, haba haba, and their old airborne chant that they would do when they were doing push-ups of 48, 49, 50. And Private First Class Charlie Jones of 1st Squad, he said he remembered watching panicked Japanese soldiers diving off the backside of the ridge, and he said it was like shooting rabbits in heavy brush. Now, Captain Kavanaugh said, the suddenness of the attack panicked the Japanese. With D Company at its heels, the enemy sought to reestablish a defensive position against the attack, but were hit before they could establish any resistance. This forward surge by the company continued for 2 to 3 hours, with the enemy running in desperation, but losing the race. Now, Private First Class Bill Dubes just said, "We shot everything in sight." A note in the regimental journal for 0850 simply says, 1st Platoon of D Company pulled a rat's ass charge on the Japs at dawn. The Japs haven't stopped running. And lest we picture a group of fresh, healthy paratroopers making the assault, most of 1st Platoon was sick with one debilitating jungle sickness or another, or several, and all of them were suffering from malnourishment. Again, this was over 30 days into the island campaign, and just to give you an example, Sergeant Royal Streck, for example, he was so feverish that he had to be guided down the hill after the rat's ass charge because he could not even walk straight. No, Company D's assault was affected by a small band of brothers who refused to quit or let each other down. As Marine aviator, astronaut, and U.S. Senator John Glenn explained, you train people to have more loyalty to their unit than they have to themselves, to the point where people will go out and do things that defy all instincts of self-preservation, like make a rat's ass charge against 10-to-1 odds. As 1st Platoon continued their advance, Private First Class Dean Marks noted, when we got into the Japanese area past their main line of resistance, you could see them laying all over the place in grotesque positions, half in and half out of their holes. Some were dead, some were convulsing, some were moaning, a lot of them ran away. He said the whole firefight lasted 3 or 4 minutes. We did not lose one person dead, but John Batory took a .25 caliber slug in the shoulder. And my grandpa, when he was remembering all this, he said, jungle foliage was thick, making it difficult to get through, but we somehow kept together fighting until about noon when Captain Kavanaugh passed another platoon through us, and we were able to stop for a much needed rest. And, I wish I had asked Steve or my grandpa which platoon came next. I believe it was 2nd Platoon. But with rain falling, 1st Platoon moved into the retreating enemy's former positions. And, of course, enemy dead lay everywhere. But there was one Japanese soldier who was kind of playing possum. And, he jumped up and he rushed to attack Private First Class Alex Village Center, who was affectionately known as the Chief. And the Chief just reflexively beheaded the Japanese soldier with his machete. The young angels of 1st Platoon breathed sighs of relief that they had survived another engagement as the success of their assault settled in. My grandpa said that they later figured out, he said, I estimate we killed over 300 that day. Heavy losses for the enemy, but almost miraculously, only 3 angels were wounded during the rat's ass charge. George Taylor, David Red Isles, and John Bad Soldier Batory. And one thing I want to point out is that when the angels began searching these hundreds of enemy dead, they discovered that there was no evidence of any Japanese officers in the area. And to my knowledge, no one ever found out the full story on that, but it's kind of an interesting piece of this story. Now, after listening to reports of D Company's effective rout on the ridge, Colonel Orrin Hogan turned to his staff and said, "Tell General Swing we will have the trail to Ormoc Bay open for him today." Now remember, Hard Rock did not want General Swing to bring up the 187th Glider Infantry, so he was pretty happy to report their success on the ridge. And back on the ridge itself, Captain Kavanaugh said, "With more bravado than sense, I sent a runner to the rear to inform the battalion commander," again, Major Frank Holcomb, "that we had overcome the enemy with a bayonet charge and that he was on the run and that we were in hot pursuit." So Rusty had continued to press the attack with D Company's 2nd and 3rd platoons. But to his surprise, his runner came back with orders to halt, and Rusty said, "Needless to say, I disregarded the order, feeling that if we paused, the enemy would have a chance to regroup and establish defensive positions." So D Company pushed forward a short distance when another runner arrived and emphatically repeated Holcomb's order to stop. So 2,500 yards after the attack began, Rusty reluctantly had his sweat-drenched company move off the trail to rest in a grove of palm and mango and papaya trees. And their new position overlooked Ormoc Bay, where these tired angels could actually look down and see 7th Infantry Division positions at the base of the mountains. Where they were headed, then of course they noticed that, tents are set up, and there's the beach right there, so it was obviously a place they wanted to get to. But a short while later, G and E companies of the 187th Glider Infantry passed through D Company's lines and continued pressing down towards the coast. And the 187th Joseph B. Giordano noted that his fellow glidermen were impressed by Company D's charge. He wrote, "We went forward to overtake the lead elements of the 511th, who were pushing forward at a breakneck speed. It was difficult to understand how a unit engaged in bitter fighting could keep up the terrific rate of march forward. The trails everywhere were littered with enemy dead, as was the slopes of the ridge." And with steel in their eyes, D Company watched the clean uniformed and, they said, much better fed glider riders march past their grove of trees towards the beach with General Swing leading the way. And these paratroopers told me that they felt that after all they had done, the march down to Ormoc Bay should have belonged to the 511th PIR. And there has been some rumor that Colonel Hogan's men were halted, in part because of their haggard appearance. While they had inflicted destruction upon the enemy, the brass felt that the 511th's paratroopers looked a little bit like death warmed over, and so they wanted a fresher, cleaner-looking unit to arrive on the beaches for publicity. Everyone knew that there were correspondents with cameras waiting for the 11th Airborne down in Ormoc Bay, and the 511th Angels felt, yeah, that triumphal march into Ormoc Bay should have been ours. So this treatment was a source of resentment within the 511th for years. But there is perhaps another side to General Swing's decision that day. I think the general knew that after a month of heavy fighting, Hard Rock Hogan's mighty 511th PIR was down to roughly 60% strength. And of that 60%, most of the paratroopers were sick or worn out from the fighting and the jungle environment. So Captain Kavanaugh, hinted at this himself. He said, "We came out on the other side of the island a pretty well decimated regiment." Now, Private First Class Eli Bernheim, who had been in Company B of the 511th, but was now in the 187th 2nd Battalion, he said, "I can recall that the 511th troopers were really pissed off when we passed through them near Ormoc, but they looked extremely beat." Now, I also think that General Swing was estimating that there would probably be another defensive line of enemy positions between them and Ormoc Bay, and he wanted to pass the 187th through the 511th to let a fresher unit assault those next lines. And one 187th historian noted of their march through the 511th lines and past Company D. He said, "For weeks, the 511th had been fighting desperately, repulsing banzai attacks at night, attacking the Japanese by day, and using all available men for carrying patrols. Hence, neither side got much rest. The 511th's men were emaciated from lack of food. Many fell prey to jungle fevers. All were taut with strain. Their feet were in horrible condition since most of their jump boots were worn out. So now they hobbled about with their feet wrapped in banana leaves." And despite all that, remember, D Company had to be ordered twice to stop fighting after the rat's ass charge. So Captain Kavanaugh had D Company dig in for the night on December 22nd, and his hungry angels were grateful that they were within a grove of fruit trees, which provided a dinner of papayas and mangoes. And, some of the angels sat in their foxholes singing, "I'm Dreaming of an Ormoc Christmas," to the tune of Irving Berlin's 1942 hit, White Christmas. And over 6,000 miles away, Captain Richard Dick Winters, an Easy Company of the 506th PIR, huddled in their own foxholes in Bastone's frozen soil. Though they were all tired, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Lottie proudly pointed out that the 511th PIR had all but wiped out the Japanese 26th Division and much of the 16th Division on Leyte. So did D Company ever receive recognition for their effective rat's ass charge? Well, Captain Kavanaugh said, "The company never received the acknowledgement deserved for effecting the breakout from the mountains of Leyte, except for our regimental commander, Colonel Hogan, who recognized what we had done." In fact, when General Swing passed Captain Kavanaugh's position, remember he's leading 187th forward, General Swing only paused long enough to tell Steve, "Nice job," before moving on to head towards Ormoc and the welcome reception waiting there. And Steve later wrote, again, remember Steve had 30 years of military service, but he said, "My thoughts regarding that gentleman were at that moment anything but complimentary." Hopefully this video helps the angels of 1st Platoon, Company D, 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment get the recognition that Captain Kavanaugh and Colonel Hogan felt they deserved. And speaking of recognition, many in 1st Platoon felt John Batory deserved the Medal of Honor for his actions that day when he charged the Japanese column. Now, remembering Batory's charge, Corporal Wilbur Wilcox noted it took a lot of guts by John, but that was something he was never short of. So Captain Kavanaugh put John in for the Silver Star, but unfortunately it was later downgraded to the Bronze Star. But John didn't care. This screw-up from Brooklyn, who would retire a Command Master Sergeant with over 30 years of jump status, he would say decades later, "There are two kinds of military reputations. One is official and on paper in Washington. The other is the one that goes from bar to bar from the mouths of those who served with you there. That is the only reputation I ever really cared about." And John's reputation as the machine gunner who charged a Japanese column indeed went from bar to bar from the mouths of those he served with for decades after the war. John was asked to retell this story at 11th Airborne Division reunions over the years, and it caught the attention of world-famous artist and sculptor William Wild Bill Porteous, who served in the 511th PIR's 2nd Battalion during the war. Perhaps one of the reasons John's story captivated Bill was that Bill, too, was a machine gunner. Now, Bill Porteous was such a kind man, and I appreciated communicating with him prior to his death in 2021. His sculptures and paintings are all over the world, but this statue, Bill made this one to honor John Batory's charge on Leyte on December 22nd, 1944. Now, Bill brought the statue to the 11th Airborne Association reunion held in 1982 at Fort Benning, Georgia, and of course, everyone marveled at his work. He'd actually brought a bust of General Swing at another reunion that was just beautiful as well. But my grandmother, Jane Carrico, said that when Bill found out that John Batory was both alive and at the 1982 reunion, Bill was delighted to be able to meet him and spend some time with John and my grandfather Andy and other members of D Company who were there that day. And you can see some of the photos of this meeting here. Well, fast forward to September of 2010, 65 years almost to the day after the end of World War II, when a big box shows up at my grandparents' home in Venice, Florida. You see, my grandmother had worked out a deal with Bill Porteous to purchase the rat's ass statue for my grandfather, and you can see just how excited he was. Now, Grandpa initially said it cost too much money, but my grandmother loved her 11th Airborne Angel and was so proud of him and all of his buddies for what they did in the war. This statue remained in their home until Grandpa passed in 2016, and after his funeral service there in Florida, this statue was a reminder of their love, and Grandma took it with her when she moved to her old hometown of Roanoke, Virginia, where my family has lived since the 1700s. And before her own passing, Grandma said she wanted me to have the statue so I could use it to continue to tell the stories of the mighty 11th Airborne Division in World War II and beyond. So next time I'm doing a book signing or lecture in your hometown, be sure to stop by and see the rat's ass charge statue and get a good look at John Bad Soldier Batory. You can learn more about John and the 11th Airborne Division in World War II through our books, When Angels Fall, the 511th PIR in World War II, which people often say is the band of brothers of the Pacific Theater. We also have our 2-volume series, Down from Heaven, the 11th Airborne Division in World War II. Volume 3 is coming soon. It will cover the Korean War, so stay tuned for some announcements on that. All of our books are available wherever history publications are sold, especially Amazon. But if you want signed copies, you can get those through our online store, 11thairbornestore.com. There you can also purchase our new Challenge coin, which celebrates the 80th anniversary of the 11th Airborne Division's historic raid on the Los Baños internment camp, where the Angels rescued over 2,100 civilians from behind enemy lines. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to this channel, and then share it with a friend. We have a lot more history coming your way, but until then, thanks again for joining us today. We'll see you in the next episode. Down from Heaven comes 11, airborne all the way. Down from heaven comes 11.